So today, we started last year, no, 2 years ago, having one of our sessions be each year be focused on the ins and outs of a different grant type. So 2 years ago, we talked about CDAs and K-Award, or CDAs specifically. So those are career development awards through the VA. And we heard from folks that had some CDAs, and we also heard from folks that know something about CDAs. Last year, we heard about first-time RO1s from a couple of fortunate folks who actually had first-time RO1s. And this time, we decided to focus on Department of Defense funding, which is something that it's very interesting. It's certainly relevant to the Alzheimer's research space, but it is also very mysterious. And there are ways that it is not what you think, or it is different from what you think, or different from what you're used to. So we'll be talking through some of those details. So Brian is going to be talking about the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs, CDMRPs, with unsolicited comments from me along the way. I'll be talking about non-CDMRP funding, so other DoD sources of funds. We also have Pamela Allen on the line here, who is a administrator in the Seattle Institute for Biomedical, the Biomedical and Clinical Research, which is a foundation affiliate of the VA. So she does a lot of pre-award stuff. So putting grants in before, getting grants ready to put in for VA investigators. But she consequently has helped a lot of us put in a lot of DoD grants. And so she knows a lot of the ins and outs of the administrative side of things. And so we'll have a Q&A period that'll be open to you folks. Does that all sound good? All right, Brian, you ready to roll?
Yeah, I think so.
Let me unshare. All right, you're up.
Okay.
Maybe we should introduce ourselves and why you and I are talking about DoD funding. Maybe you could start.
Sure. So I'm Brian Kraemer. I am, co-director of Alzheimer's disease T32, which some of you know me from. I'm also associate director for research in the GREC in Seattle, which is a geriatrics research education and clinical center. I am a longtime DoD reviewer and have been once upon a time, but not currently funded by the CDMRP ALS research program. And I was just going to share what I've learned. For some reason, this did not start on the first slide, which is a little annoying to me. Can you see my slides or not?
I can see your slides, but it's on funding cycle and logo.
Yeah, that's like halfway through for some reason. I've had trouble today with my PowerPoint. Give me just a sec.
I'll introduce myself while we're going. I'm Jeff Iliff. I'm the Associate Director for Research at another VA center, the Mental Illness Research Education and Clinical Center, which focuses on TBI. I'm also in psychiatry and neurology, and co-lead direct with Brian. The reason why I'm talking today is I've also reviewed for CDMRP. I have some DoD funding, including some that's connected through the CDMRP and some that is non-CDMRP. And I've just finished a 2-year stint on the CDMRP Traumatic Brain Injury and Psychological Health Program Committee, which has a different role in the grant process than a standard review committee does. And we'll talk more about what that means. So I can maybe provide a little bit of insight there. All right, Brian.
Great, thanks. So, obviously the VA is close to kind of downstream of the DoD in terms of the soldier experience. And so there's a lot of overlap there. That's part of the reason why you see a lot of DoD interest here. This material is going to be complicated or easy for you depending on how much you know about NIH grant submissions. If you know some stuff about the NIH, then this is going to be harder because you're going to have to unlearn things. If you don't know about any grants submissions and review processes, then this will be a little easier to understand, but they're very different. And that's going to be one of the take-home messages. So CDMRP, give you an overview. So that stands for the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. I'm sorry, it's not advancing. What the heck? There we go. Okay. Stands for the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. So this is a Department of Defense funded enterprise for research that is run through the U.S. Army Medical Command. And that is pretty confusing. The reason that this exists is when Congress decides it wants to spend money on a given disease, they cannot go to NIH and say, hey, I want to spend an extra $100 million on breast cancer research. NIH will not accept that money. And so Congress found another way to get that done, and that is to stand up this agency, which they will essentially earmark money in various budgets for different topics. And so there are many of them. We'll go over kind of the list in a little while, but it's not a small enterprise. Oh, there's a typo there. When that says greater than $2.5 in funding, that's actually $2.5 billion in funding, not dollars. So I just think in billions, that's it. Anyhow. So the thing that's different about the DoD versus the NIH is it's a two-tiered review process. And in the NIH peer review process, scientific merit is pretty much the sole driver of whether or not you get funded. You can argue about whether or not their scoring system reflects merit, but that's what they do. This is a much more complicated decision process. There are multiple variables that differ somewhat between programs, but at the end of the day, there's a programmatic focus and a scientific focus, and they are, I would say, programmatic focus is more important than scientific focus, but they're both very important. And one of the take-home messages that I'm going to give you today is that CDMRP is not the same as NIH. NIH and VA are very similar. So if you understand how the VA works for grant review, you're going to understand NIH and vice versa. For this, that is not the case. The other thing to know is the pay lines for different programs are very highly variable, ranging from less than 1% to 20%, I would say, is probably the range. Maybe even a little higher than that. And so it really depends on the program. It pays to do your research to figure out what has gone on in the past and what their budget is this year. The other thing about CDMRP is it's organized by specific disease programs. And the things that are related to dementia, I'm going to talk about today. Foremost among those, I think, is or most relevant is the peer-reviewed Alzheimer's disease research program, or PRARP. A lot of these acronyms are very hard to pronounce, but that's what. Also got experience with the ALS research program. I have no experience with the Gulf War illness research program, but they are concerned with dementia. The multiple sclerosis program a little bit. The toxic exposures research program is what they now call their Parkinson's program. And Jeff talked about his role in the integration panel for traumatic brain injury and psychological health. And then DoD has a tuberous sclerosis complex, which is a program on tuberous sclerosis, which is not really a dementia disorder, but sort of related, at least to the tau pathology side. And the DoD actually runs the largest tuberous sclerosis program in the world. So bigger than NIH, bigger than any other place. So they really, and it's not a huge program. I think it's $20 million or something, but it's just the kind of vagaries of what Congress wants to fund is how they decide things, and they stand up new programs with some regularity. All right, so here's the take-home message. CDMRP review and NIH review are not the same. Do not, even though there seems to be some superficial similarities, do not think that is how it works. And we'll get into dive into the details in a little bit. So CDMRP was established in the 90s. The total funding through 2017 is like 12 billion. Since then, they've more than doubled the yearly funding. I think they're closing in on $3 billion a year for fiscal year 23. That's what I heard. Although we'll see what happens to that budget. So the grants and contracts awarded, over 10,000, and they really treat even their grants more like contracts. Their breast cancer program is by far their biggest, but they have a large prostate cancer program as well. Some of these have nothing to do with the DoD other than that's where the funding sits, because the DoD is very good at doing large contracts, and a lot of the administration here is actually handled by contractors. There's a few personnel that are DoD employees, but most of them work for, I think General Dynamics has the contract currently, but they're, it bounces around from time to time. But it doesn't seem to change the program much when the contractor changes. Here's a graph by indication of funding from 92 to 2017. You can see there's a whole bunch of different programs of varying size. And we can talk more about that as time goes on. The other thing I would say is that not all of these programs have been around the whole time. So they come into existence and go out of existence or go on hiatus for a funding cycle or two. So, it kind of bounces around depending on the disease you're talking about. The Alzheimer's program is relatively new. I want to say like the past 5 years or so. TBI, much older. So there's a two-tiered review process. The first part is scientific review, kind of process, which if you've submitted grants before, you're going to be familiar with in kind of the broad, broader context. But that's only the first step. And really it's kind of, the science needs to get over a certain threshold to be considered. But the best grants do not necessarily get funded from a scientific review, scoring standpoint. The grants that get funded are the ones that have a good scientific merit and are the best fit programmatically. So if the peer review panel does not judge the science to be sound, it will not get funded no matter how good the fit is. But it's a bit different, and we'll get into why that is the case. But first, I'm going to share some of the wealth that isn't on the internet in the form of logos and diagrams of the funding cycle. And it's a somewhat Byzantine funding cycle. But the way it starts, and I'll kind of move through a couple of these actually, is within a congressional appropriation. Congress passes a budget that has some amount of money set aside to fund a given disease, let's say Alzheimer's disease in this case. So they set aside $10 million. And they have a series of stakeholder meetings, if they need them, to decide what the vision for the program is. And then they put together a program announcement. And this program announcement, I'll go into why and how, but you need to pay attention to what that actually says. From the program announcement, they will accept like a pre-application LOI type of submission. It's like, I have this idea I want to, submit. And the vision setting folks that put together the program announcement will look over those pre-applications or LOIs, and they will reject usually about half of them. So sometimes more, sometimes less, but usually about the cut is about 50% of the submissions are put forward to an invitation to send in a full application. And so that's a pretty big cut. And that's pretty much just made on perceived programmatic fit. It's not really, there's no scientific basis for that rejection or acceptance. So it's about fit at that point. They accept applications, usually greater than 90% of the invited applicants actually do submit a grant, depends on the program a bit, but most of the applications do actually show up from the LOI invitation. And so, we're talking about a process from the time they make the announcement to the time you submit. That's like usually 9 months or so. So it takes a while. And there's one cycle per year, assuming Congress is passing budgets normally. So that's another thing to consider. Once the applications are received in relatively short order, there'll be a peer review meeting, like 3 or 4 months after the due date, typically. And at that peer review meeting, it is a scientific review process. We'll get into the details on that a little more, but the grants get scored. And then the product of peer review that goes to programmatic review isn't so much the score. The score is not really important, except for the fact that it's either good enough or not good enough. What goes to the programmatic review is the summary statement. That is the summary of discussion and the main score driving strengths and weaknesses of the application. And that is in the form of the review panel chair's summary of the discussion and the written comments that are made. And it's all encapsulated into a document that's given for each grant to the programmatic panel. So they don't see the original grant. They don't see all the scores. They just see a digest of the review. And so it's a very different kind of programmatic review than, say, an NIH program review, which is kind of in some ways more detailed because they have access to everything, but in a lot of ways less in depth, because NIH program review is really about, is everything correct? And this is more about, does this fit the original program announcement? The programmatic panel will make recommendations for funding, which then get reconciled against the available budget. And then it goes into the Army command structure, who either approves or does not approve the grant funding, which then starts kind of post-award or award negotiations and post-award management. And then it's got a series of reporting requirements that are a bit more rigorous than you'd see at NIH or VA, but not overwhelming, I would say. So here's another diagram that I found online, another logo. Basically, I think this one's a little better, actually. It's less hard to follow, but it's the same sort of situation. So from the time Congress dishes up some money to the time the research is completed, that might be 6, 7, maybe even 8 years, depending on what's going on. With the first year and a half or so, that just being, getting the program rolling for the year's program priorities and, choosing the grants that are going to be funded. Here's another logo. I really don't like this one, so we're not even talk about it, but just, there's a little more detail on the back end in terms of awards management, but you get the idea. So here's kind of a decision tree, if you like that better. Just laying out, how things go. Submit a pre-application. It's either rejected, which you can submit again the next year if you want, or it's put forward. Frequently, the focus areas change from year to year, so it's important that you shouldn't just resubmit a grant because it did poorly, but not quite, or it did well enough and it didn't get funded. You need to look at the program announcement. We'll talk more about that. And then, this is just, the whole decision tree about how things go. It's, a complicated process compared to NIH and VA, but it's really not that bad if you focus on a few key issues. And for those of you that have done NIH peer review, I think this is probably going to be somewhat helpful to just spell out the differences. So at NIH, the goal of peer review is to rank all the applications based on the quality of the science. So you have, at the end of a study section, if everything has gone very well, there's a list of applications from best to worst. And given the percentile they get, they will get, the ones above that percentile are not funded. The ones below that are funded, and the grants all move forward. At CDMRP, they're not scored that way. There's no ranking of applications. And if the panel tries to rank them relative to each other, then the program people get angry. And so that doesn't happen there. What happens is the grants are scored against a gold standard, which is essentially what would be a perfect grant in the panel's eyes, and how close is this grant to perfect. And so, if all the grants are really good, they might all get, really high scores. And the CDMRP does not care about score compression like NIH does. It's not an issue for them. So, the other thing I would say is at CDMRP, program directed work is really pretty much everything. You got to look at the program announcement. There is no investigator initiated, I've got a new idea that has nothing to do with your program announcement. And that's, that does not do well. So it's got to fit with the program. For CDMRP, an LOI is always required. NIH, unless it's a special PAR, that doesn't happen. At CDMRP, the summary statement is really the review product that goes to programmatic decision. And at NIH, it's really just about the ranking. At CDMRP, there are flexible program funding decisions, and I'll show you a specific example of what that looks like with the grant that I got. But the funding can come in in, parts. They might only fund a single aim of a grant, or they may only have a partial budget that year. And so they may have funded all the proposed grants only partially. There's all sorts of weird things that they will do with funding to kind of, get the most bang for their buck, which is an interesting model. At NIH, it's really all or nothing. If the reviewers hate AIM 2, that's it. The grant's dead. If the reviewers hate AIM 2 at CDMRP, the program, program review, they may say, okay, we like this grant except for AIM 2, cut that out, cut that budget for AIM 2, and do the rest of it. And that's not uncommon to have the review at the program level influence what gets funded and not, and sub components of a grant can be funded. It's not not unusual. The funding mechanism, CDMRP, is more like a contract. At NIH, it's a research grant, generally speaking. At CDMRP, the focus is more on patient impact and program impact. At NIH, it's really about the science, the knowledge, moving the field forward is what NIH cares about. At CDMRP, it's more about propelling their program and impacting the patients. And so at NIH, you have scientific reviewers. That's all that's in the room when your grant gets reviewed, and then program people at the program review. But at CDMRP, there are at least two different kinds of reviewers. Sometimes there's a statistical reviewer as well for some programs. But the two main types are the scientific reviewer, which is what you're used to dealing with if you've submitted an NIH grant. That is people like me and Jeff, or you folks in a couple of years probably, reviewing grants as they come in for their scientific merit and potential impact, quality and rigor and all that sort of stuff. But they also have consumer reviewers, and for each panel that might look a little different. But what a consumer reviewer is an advocate for a given indication. So for Alzheimer's disease panels, they would have usually not patients, because cognitive function is required. Good cognitive function is required for the task, but like spouses or children of dementia patients that really are advocates for the disease. Frequently they're involved in the Alzheimer's Association or AIM or other sorts of advocacy groups, and they are very invested in Alzheimer's funding. And some of them will have lobbied Congress to get the funding that's been secured, all sorts of things like that. But they come into the room as lay people that are very passionate about the disease, but generally don't know a lot about the science. And so their focus is really to kind of, ground the panel in patient impact. And so, if you have a proposal about molecular mechanisms and it doesn't come back to therapeutics or biomarkers or something that's going to impact the patient, it's not going to go well with the consumer reviewer. They will not like that. They like new therapies. They like biomarkers. They don't allow clinical trials. They like to have direct impact in general on the field. So it's a different, sort of situation in terms of the dynamics of review. And usually it's, each grant will be assigned one consumer reviewer and 2 or 3 scientific reviewers. So that's how it works. Whereas at NIH, it would be 3 or 4 scientific reviewers, and that's it. So here's a QR code that leads to their glossy, propaganda for the year for the 2023 PRARP mechanism. They have 3 different funding opportunities: a Transforming Research Award, a Transforming Care Award, and a Transforming Diagnosis Award. As you might imagine, the diagnosis is focused on things like biomarkers and imaging. The care is about, helping with caregiver burden. Transforming research is generally about drug discovery and, innovation, cutting edge sort of things. They'll always list the program priorities. DEI is up there. Here we've got ADRD, whereas in the past it was really focused on AD more. Diagnosis, so, these are the kind of global sorts of areas. And this is just kind of an advertisement to get, attract both reviewers and applicants. All right. And here's just like some numbers of, what's gone on. For this particular program, they're very interested and starting kind of early stage work that's going to lead to bigger grants, NIH funding or things like that. On other programs, it's more standalone, or focused on filling gaps. But, this is just to give you some idea of what that looks like. If you have questions or, want, I can drop links into the chat when we're done for you guys to find things online. So, here's like their little outline about how you might act if you're thinking about an application. And the most important part of this is really right here. Review the program announcement and the broad, like the glossy sheet I just showed you there, and make sure that what you're doing fits that. And I can't emphasize this enough. Do not convince yourself that what you're doing fits it by massaging it in just the right way. That generally goes poorly for the applicant. Program priorities really matter in this, and so you want to have a good fit. And certainly I tell all my mentees, if the program announcement is what you're doing, if it's like there's something in there that's like this is what I'm doing, then apply. If it's like you're not what you're doing, definitely don't apply. And if you're not sure, I probably wouldn't apply, or I would at least talk to the program about it and see what their attitude is. But in general, you want a really good fit with the program announcement. If you think you've got a really good fit, then, and this is an annual cycle, so this happens once a year, and I think there's usually about 3 months between the program announcement and the LOI deadline. You'd submit your LOI, and that would go to the integration panel, which would either then invite a submission or not. And like I said, it's about a 50-50 chance on that. If they invite a submission, you'll have a couple, 2 to 3 months to put together a full application and submit it. And then that goes online and off to peer review. And usually 6 to 9 months after you submit, you'll get an answer back about what their funding decision was, but that's not necessarily final. So, as I said, the big issue here is, deciding whether your thing fits CDMRP. So this is the first page of this year's announcement, and I figured maybe the Transforming Research Award would be most popular amongst our trainees. I don't know, but this is what the cover page looks like. There's about a 30-page document, I think, that has a lot of details in there. But what you need to do is go get this, and then go to, I don't know, the table of contents and find out where their focus areas are, and go look that up. And that's what you need to look at. And so this year's focus areas for this grant type are identification of risk factors, including but not limited to environmental, genetic, epigenetic, and lifestyle, identification of implementation of culturally competent strategies to reduce AD/ADRD risk and prevent cognitive problems following TBI and or military service. So the lines between TBI and dementia are blurred both in this program and in the TBI program. So, it's, if you've got any interest in TBI, but are more dementia focused, it's still worth looking at the TBI program as well. If you're not interested in dementia, probably this isn't a good program, even if you're interested in other effects of TBI. But, there's a blurry line there for sure. Understanding the role of social determinants of health and risk, and epidemiology and environment seem to be important as well. And so if your idea doesn't fall into one of these cleanly, probably not a good idea to apply this year, or look at other programs. And like I said, if your interest has got a movement disorders component, look at the PD program announcement. If your interest is, kind of aligned with TBI, look at the TBI announcement, and so forth. And the second part I would advise is to, and I'm sure Pamela will back this up, read the instructions for the application process. Review panel is not terribly forgiving of people thinking this is an NIH grant and following NIH rules. They want you to follow their own specific rules, which are a bit different. And there's, a long document here to look at as well. But, at SIVCR, wherever you are, I'm sure there's a program manager that will help you. If you're at the VA, Pamela will help you put this sort of thing together. So, the first place where the rubber meets the road is submitting the LOI. You submit it through electronic portal called eBRAP. DoD likes its interesting acronyms, and that will allow you to track your LOI and your submission, although your scores will never show up in eBRAP. That comes by email. Don't ask me why, but that's what happens. And so, here's some ALS stuff that I submitted, back in the day, and I haven't submitted a grant to them in a long time, but it still sits there in eBRAP and you can still see it. If things go well, your application will get a notification of acceptance. They'll also notify you by email that it's been accepted typically. And that means it's time to get ready to start preparing for a full application. And so there'll be a deadline for that. And it's very much like ERA Commons in the sense that you assemble a bunch of things in there, but a little bit different. And again, your grants manager can help you sort that out. There are a few components that are different that I just want to touch on a little bit. Again, on the theme that CDMRP is not like NIH, the additional components are a lay abstract, and for a lot of organizations like, say, the Alzheimer's Association, the lay abstract is not very important. The reviewers don't spend any time looking at that because they're scientists. But at CDMRP, the lay abstract may be the only piece of the document that a consumer reviewer can easily understand if you do it right. And so it's important that you get as much as you can into that lay abstract, because one of the 3 reviewers that looks at your grant and is really driving your score is going to base a lot of what they decide on that lay abstract plus what the scientific reviewers say. So don't discount the importance of that. There's a DoD format biosketch, which is a distinct format from NIH, I'm sad to tell you, so that's a bit of a drag to put together if you don't have one. You also have.
If I can interrupt to just put people at ease there, DoD accepts the NIH biosketch.
Oh my goodness, when did they start doing that?
The last few years.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So
Wow.
one less thing for people to worry about.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, back when I did this, it was a nightmare because you had to put together all the same information in a different format. It was a lot
They
of work.
accept the NIH biosketch. They do not yet accept the NIH other support. So there is a special DoD version of the other support.
Right. That you don't have to put that in up front, do you? I don't think you do.
You do for DoD.
You do now.
DoD requires both the biosketch and what they call the previous current pending support, PCPS.
Okay. Yeah, that's.
This is why you include the admin early in the process.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And this
Coming
is why
from another admin.
Right. This is why you don't go to Brian for admin advice as well. Because what I know here is old. Because the last time I did one of these was 7-8 years ago now.
It has changed.
Yeah.
I'd say the last 5 years have seen a lot of changes.
Right. And that's one thing I would say about both DoD and the VA relative to NIH. NIH moves pretty slowly in terms of the evolution of things compared to DoD and VA, which seem to change more rapidly and with less warning. Anyhow, so okay, don't worry about the biosketch. Never mind. There's also an impact statement, which is kind of a one-pager on how this is going to impact, not the NIH, when you think about impact, you're thinking about impact on the field. At CDMRP, when you think about impact, you're thinking about impact on patient care and the CDMRP program goals for that particular program. Okay. There's also, for many of them, there's an innovation statement. For some, there's not, but innovation can be very important. And then there's like a very contract-like statement of work that's required, which is typically not found in most NIH grants. Okay, so once you've submitted your grant, you wait, and eventually a funding decision shows up in your email, and it might say something like this: congratulations, we're not giving you any money, but you're runner-up, which is kind of the default situation. And one of the lessons at DoD is sometimes you have to wait, sometimes quite a while, even when they say right out of the gate they're going to fund you. So patience is important. But, the later they may follow up, and what was that difference in time? So yeah, like, 5 months later, they follow up and say, congratulations, now we actually have money. And we're going to support. I think the overall budget for this was 450K or 500K. So it was like, 25% of the budget. We ended up doing the skinniest aim, the first aim of this grant with this money, which was perfect because that led us to a larger, the preliminary data to write a VA grant on the same sort of stuff. And, it allowed us to bootstrap our way into the problem. So yeah, it's not what I hoped for when I wrote the grant, but it did get funded. But this is just an example of how DoD can slice and dice projects to fund components of them. And that's not to say they do that all the time. I think their preference is to fund whole projects, but depending on their budget. And I think the year this was funded, they were funding 2 projects. So it was, it was a pretty small program at the time. As much as, doubled in size, and I think they've quadrupled or quintupled this therapeutic idea award in particular. So they're giving like 10 or 12 of them now. But that's the other lesson is most of the programs grow, not shrink. So if you think a program is too small, keep an eye on it. It'll get bigger over as time passes generally. Okay, so one final time, they're not the same. Don't forget that part. I'll take your questions. Or we're doing questions at the end.
Let's do questions at the end.
Okay.
I'm gonna add just a couple of things to what Brian said. So I sat for 2 years on a program committee that was making the funding decisions for the TBI psychological health program. So that's a $180 million annual program. And a bunch of things I noticed from that perspective that are worth passing along. And I can't say what happened in those rooms, but I can tell you like some things. So first, Brian said this, but I want to really re-articulate this. Read the instructions in the program announcement. The program committee, when they are setting the vision at the beginning of the year, they have a bunch of things that they think are important. And then they also have a bunch of ways they want to change the grants that they're funding. Like they'll look back on last year's grants and say, I didn't like that we didn't see any of this. I didn't like that we saw so much of that. And they will articulate those desires in the program announcement. And if you don't pay attention to them, you run the risk of essentially providing them something that they have no interest in, or they're actually antagonistic toward. Okay. So as an example, so I'll take you to this program's website. This is the TBI-PH website. And there's sequential layers of information, right? So if you go through all these things, there you have the glitz sheet, which is like, hey, look at all the money we have, and we're going to fund all this awesome stuff. And here's your deadlines, right? Which is kind of informative. I think that they're trying to gin up interest, but more specific, here are their focused areas, right? So these are the things, your grant should be answering at least one of these points, one of these bullet points. But then it is also important to actually read the program announcement. So if you go to the top of the program announcement here, this is like a billion page, 70 pages, which sounds horrible, right? But there's actually stuff in here that is important that was put in here on purpose. So some of it's boilerplate, but some of it is very specific. So as an example, this is the investigator-initiated award for the TBI psychological health program. And it has this little nugget right here. If animal models are proposed, consider the following: pairing clinical populations to animal models in order to validate clinical relevance and development, prevention, assessment, treatment solutions encouraged. Proposed animal models should be well justified, supported within the literature, and clearly aligned with clinical relevance. This is put in because someone on the program committee doesn't like the predictive power of TBI preclinical models, right? And so if you submit a TBI preclinical model that doesn't include human data, right, or isn't really well established with clearly demonstrated corollaries in human populations, even if you score a 1.2, which is a very, very top score, it'll still get rejected, because this is essentially saying, hey guys, we're not funding that anymore. And of ignoring these small points. Like there's little information in here that will tell you, or will try to tell you, what to do and what not to do.
But when they say words like consider, you should replace that with a phrase like thou shalt do the following. Because if you don't, you're sunk.
Couple other things. So these are things that happen at the review, at the program review level. At least the TBI PH program, there is every review every grant gets a statistical reviewer, meaning a biostatistician is reviewing every single grant in addition to the scientific, in addition to the consumer reviewer. I don't know if that's true across other programs, but that's true at TBI PH. And one of the key criteria is basically when you do animal justifications or sample size justifications for clinical trials, if that statistical reviewer cannot replicate your power analysis with the data that you provide, it's regarded as deficient, right? If you don't include a power analysis and you just say, well, we found that these sample sizes are good, that is a killer. And there's a review criteria on your statistical plan. And when committee members are looking, things that they like, big red flags are, if your approach has a low score or is flawed, that's a killer. If your statistical section is flawed, that can also be a killer, because that brings into question whether your study is even going to be able to answer the question you're looking out for. So there's a much more rigorous statistical evaluation for at least for this program, and I suspect this might be true across other DoD programs.
So I can comment. It depends, I think, on the specific focus, right? So if it's clinical in ALS, then yes, they have a statistical reviewer. If it's like their therapeutic development program, yes. If it's their therapeutic idea program, no. So I think the closer you get to clinic, the more that's likely. If it's a field that has more statistical history of statistical issues like TBI, I think you'll see it in all the programs. For Alzheimer's, on the therapeutic idea side, no. At least not as of, I'm trying to figure out when I did this last. It's like a year or two ago. But it is some programs, and for TBI, I think it's all over.
Last, suppose you submit a grant and this actually happened to me this year. So we submitted a grant for the Parkinson's program and it got a 1.4, which is a very high score, and it was not funded. And so what that is, and so we as investigators sat around and said, should we resubmit and try to get a 1.2? What does it mean if I get a good score and it doesn't get funded? What it means is the thing that you're studying, while it may be important, it seems to be scientifically valid and it has high scientific value, for whatever reason, it doesn't have programmatic value, or there's already too much of whatever that is in the portfolio. So decisions on what gets funded, what Brian said is true. There's sort of a level below which, if you score below that, you actually can't, like by law, you can't be funded. But as long as you make that cut, then things like, is this what we want to be about? Do we have any other research in this space? Are they trying to fill a programmatic hole? Are they trying where they don't have something? Those are all considerations that are being made. And something that is that doesn't fit programmatically will kill a good grant. And something that fits really well programmatically, or is from a group that has a really good track record, because that's another thing that will come into these programmatic reviews, is they'll look back and say, did that person have a CDMRP grant before? How did it do? Did they have trouble with recruitment? Did they have trouble with performance or not? And so if you're a known actor, a known entity, that will tend to help, and that can get brought up. That can get brought up at the program level. Okay, that's all on that.
I would just echo what Jeff said, that I think I've submitted 2 DoD grants. The one that got the worst score was the one that got partial funding. The one that got the better score didn't get anything at all. So,
all right. So a little bit on non-CDMRP DoD funding. First is the DoD funds a lot of research that is not in the CDMRP. And the interesting thing is, when you talk to the people who run those research programs, they say, oh, in the same way that Brian says, oh, the CDMRP is different from the NIH. These people say, no, the CDMRP is basically like the NIH. So they're so far out there that when they look back at the CDMRP, it looks like it's standing right next to the NIH and the VA, right? Research is funded by a wide variety of agencies. Some of these are defined research funded, where they're agencies or groups where you would expect them to be funding research. And then there's some other pockets of money as well. So this includes the Military Operational Medicine Research Program, or MOMRP, MTech, which is a technology development consortium that is, it's essentially a money laundering outfit that the DoD uses to like develop new technologies. There are specific service connected research outfits that fund intramural research labs as well as extramural research labs. And so that's the Office of Naval Research, it's the Army Research Office, and it's the Air Force Office, Office of Air Force Research Lab, AFRL. And word is Space Force is going to have its own research office, although it's not presently online. And if you think that I'm making up Space Force, I'm not. It is actually a military agency that's coming online. There's another program called MURI, which is the Multidisciplinary Research Program for University Research Initiative. This is for multidisciplinary research projects that are of interest to the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force. And then there's research that happens more directly. So different active duty elements. So these are actually groups of soldiers, right? Actually have dollars that they can spend on research that benefits their group. And there's also the DHA, which is the Defense Health Agency. So this is like the military's medical operational like section. They do research, right? So there's research that happens at Army medical hospitals, or like hospitals on military installations, whether that's Walter Reed, whether that's down at Madigan at Joint Base Lewis McChord, or elsewhere. So there is research, intramural research funding that happens at these institutions, and you can collaborate with these groups, right? And they have access to dollars that don't necessarily require applications for you to get them. In all of these, and this is also to a lesser extent true of CDMRP, it is critical that you align that what you are doing or what you are interested in doing aligns very closely to program interests and military priorities, okay? So what Brian said about like making sure that the focus areas of the research programs make sense. When you step outside of CDMRP, now you actually really have to focus, now you have to align with not CDMRP research focus, but actually what do the military services actually care about, right? And many of the things that they care about are not the things that the US health system cares about. Many times they care about different things. So civilian priorities are very often not the same as military priorities. Sometimes they align, but often they do not. And so you have to pay close attention. When you're out in this land, you move outside of the land of things that you guys would recognize as grant applications and letters of intent into a land of briefing papers and white papers, which is where a white paper is like an abbreviated, it's like a story of your research project, why it's important, why there's a critical gap, why you know how to fill the gap, what you could do if the gap was filled, and what its relevance to the military is. White papers frequently are of variable length. They are often written not to scientific experts, but rather to high-ranking military officials or people who are in scientific program management, right? It's a very different type of writing than a grant where you're writing to other experts in academia. And frequently you're actually writing briefing papers to generals or colonels or commanders in the Navy who don't have scientific backgrounds at all, right? Or who may be clinicians without a big research background. So your ability to distill scientific information and utility and opportunity and impact into lay language without like making things not true anymore ends up being important. DoD has a very strong focus on deliverables. in these agencies, they are tasked with getting things into military usage within the next 5 to 15 to 50 years. And that different time horizon depends on the different agency, right? So MOMRP, for example, their goal is to develop things that will be in action and in use 10 years from now, right? MTech has a slightly longer time horizon. DARPA, which is another research agency that everyone has heard of because they invented, I think, the internet or something like that. Their time horizon is much longer, right? So they're looking much further downfield. But the key is, the question that they will always ask is, if I'm developing a device, as an example, when will that device be in soldiers' hands? And if the answer is in like 30 years, MOMRP has no interest, right? And so you have to match the time horizon and you have to be very deliverable focused. There's an important piece that has to do with the role of your relationship with program leadership. I'll go through a couple of these. Finding out what these people care, what these agencies care about is not always easy. So I'm going to go through some here. So this is MOMRP's Military Operational Medicine Research Programs. This is their website, which is super swank. It looks really cool. But if you try to find out what they actually care about, this is what you get, which is one slide. And it basically tells you that they're interested in how the environment affects people, how injuries affect people and military readiness, how physiology affects people, and how psychological health and resilience affects people. But if you actually try to figure out, like, okay, so what kind of grants are you looking for? You actually can't, you can hardly find any information, right? And so the only way to find out, like, if they're interested in what you're studying, is to reach out to the leads of this the leaders of this research program, and just talk to them. You have to, like, say, hey, I'm studying this thing. Is this something that MOMRP would be focused on? And through a dialogue with them, you might find a common interest and a common direction that would allow you to, like, work up a white paper and eventually work up a proposal, right? But it's a very collaborative process between you saying what you do and what your interest is in and where you guys are where you're going, and them saying specifically what they want, and them helping you to craft, like, whether, craft something that overlaps between the two. MTech's another example. So if you look at MTech, this is the device development or prototype development program. They actually publish what their interest areas are. And their interest areas are highly discrete, meaning they're very specific. And if you align with one, it's real good, but most people don't. So if you look at what they're interested in, well, they're interested in hemostasis, right? That's a pretty big place. They're interested in autonomous care and evacuation of critical care patients, right? For my group, they are very interested in pharmacological and technological approaches to measuring, manipulating lymphatic system, right? So this is a case where what we study and what they want align perfectly, right? So we actually applied for this particular grant. But you have to go dive down into their program offerings, read through these, and see if what you do or what your interest is in actually aligns with the very specific interests that they have. And then you need to contact the program staff and, like, talk through how that alignment actually works. This is the MURI. This is the Multidisciplinary University Research Initiative funding announcement. If you go into there, you'll find out that Navy is interested in these things, including deep sea benthic boundary layer, whatever that is, right? And actually, if you look through these, there's actually almost no life science in any of these. So sometimes in one year, there will be things that are very applicable to some of the things that we do in this year, not so much, right? Which means that MURI as a program is probably not relevant to most of the folks on this call this year. But next year, there will be a totally new funding announcement, and there will be a totally new list of priorities for the Navy, for the Army, and for the Air Force. And maybe something will align then, right? So they do have interest in human performance and injuries and things like that. Last, and my point here was, if you go to the Army Research Office website, it looks really nice, but if you click through to the links, it takes you almost nowhere. It takes you to a place where there's no real information. If you go to the Office of Naval Research, This looks really cool, but if you click through to these, the priorities that they list are so vague as to be useless. And if you go to the funding opportunities, it takes you to a generic US government contracting website, right? Where you're supposed to find out what their funding interests are in. So if you try to find out what they're interested in by going through their website, you'll get lost and never get any real information. And so the only way to navigate in this space is by getting to know the program staff at these in these different agencies, develop relationships with them, have them know what you're doing, have them tell you what they're interested in, and over a course of time, including sometimes years, work through a process. So relationships with program leaderships before submission are really important. And then if something is awarded, these agencies take very active roles in the management of your projects, right? So we report to, we have an MTech funded grant, for example, that we report to them every month. And we talk through how everything's going and things that need to change. And there's good sides to this, because in these cases, what they're doing is they're investing in you and your program. And so if your program needs another $1 million or $2 million, it's very easy for these people to get another $1 million or $2 million and just give it straight to you within the existing contract, right? So the funding tap can turn on and off without more applications, which is really nice. The downside is they have a lot of opinions, and they have a very specific direction they want your research to go. And so you're essentially establishing a partnership with these agencies developing things. And the last thing is, if it sounds like this is a networking intensive operation, it's because it is. A lot of these agencies and opportunities will remain closed to an investigator until they meet the right people and develop relationships with the right people. And you can only do that by being in the place where those people are. Most of these people do not go to AAIC. Some of them might go to SFN, but they're not in the same conferences that we all go to, right? The conferences that they are all at is the Military Health System Research Symposium, MHSRS, which is held every August or September for a week, often in Florida for some reason. So this one is going to be in August. It is the craziest meeting you'll ever go to. It's full of military people, but this is where all of the people who are the decision makers and the program staff for all of these programs, they're all at this conference, right? And it's a massively broad conference. So you'll go there on the poster session. There'll be sessions on Alzheimer's disease and TBI and things that we're interested in, and there'll be sessions on like developing lasers to shoot, to do weird things with, right? That you would never imagine. But this is the place where a lot of networking happens. And if you want to get into this space, in an ideal world, you would go there and know someone and have them introduce you around, and you can meet the heads of all of these programs, and you have coffee with them and you get things figured out. And that's how you find out about programmatic alignment.